Hello beautiful people and welcome, to the Aino pre-release video. Now I wasn't sure if I was going to be recording an Aino pre-release, but after doing calcs on a bunch of different teams, I figured, you know what, there's enough to say about her to warrant a pre-release. So, Aino, 4-star, Hydro Claymore, base HP 11,201, base attack 242, base defense 607, EM Ascension. She's basically an EM scaling character that does pathetic damage, so the base stats don't really matter. She's an off-fielder, so her defensive stats don't really matter either. The normal attacks, they're normal, they're whatever, who cares. Skill, Muse Catcher. Aino throws a Muse Catcher forward, dealing hydro damage and dragging her along behind it. When the dragging stops, Aino deals hydro damage to nearby opponents. You can hold it to aim and choose a direction. Think of it like Kenichi's passive exploration grappling hook, except it does the same thing in combat, and it launches you forward instead of upwards. The motion value on it is split into two, about 100 and about 300. Because it's split into two, you can't really forward vape it for big damage, because what's gonna vape is the shitty first hit, and the actual numbers on it are also just not that high overall. Elemental Burst, Precision Hydronic Cooler. Aino deploys a custom water spraying device, the Cool Your Jets Ducky, to establish a focused hydronic cooling zone. While active, the Cool Your Jets Ducky will periodically fire water balls at nearby opponents, dealing hydro damage. The frequency of this is once every 1.5 seconds, and it applies hydro every 3 seconds. But she has an ascension passive that makes it fire faster. When it fires faster, it goes to once every 0.7 seconds, and it applies hydro every around 2 seconds. Lasts for 14 seconds, cooldown 13.5, so it's basically permanent uptime if you swap back to her, but it's also low cooldown, which means that it allows you to play her in teams that have low cooldowns without extending your rotation time. We've already talked about the first ascension passive. The second ascension passive, Aino's burst damage is increased by 50% of her EM, so it basically has 50% motion value on her burst for EM. The attack motion value is around 34. The EM motion value is 50. Both of those values are pathetically low. Even if it hits every 0.7 seconds, her burst does not hit very hard. When Aino's on the party, the moon sign is increased by 1, as is the case with every Nogcry character. All of this is pretty bad. Hydro application every 2 seconds is not very fast. Her damage is not very good. The one thing that really saves Aino is that her cooldown is low enough to allow for you to play her in pretty much any team that wants a hydro character and doesn't need fast hydro. I'll talk a lot more about Flynn's in the Flynn's pre-release video, but very quickly, for Flynn's, you don't need fast hydro, so Aino provides more than enough hydro, and Aino's Constellations are fairly useful for Flynn's. At C6, Aino is generally the best hydro, but it's like 1% ahead of the alternative, so it doesn't really matter. I think the most interesting thing about Aino is not how she works in Flynn's teams, it's how she works in other teams. She applies hydro every 2 seconds, which is fairly slow, like I said, but it's not that slow, and there are teams in which that's enough. More importantly, some of her constellations increase that application. Let's quickly go through them. C1 increases her EM by 80 and your active party member's EM by 80. C2 gives her an additional hydro hit every 5 seconds, which increases her hydro up. C3 and 5 are skill levels, they're worthless. C4 is an energy restoration effect. It doesn't do too much for her because she doesn't really care. She has multiple weapon options that help her with energy a lot. And then C6 increases lunar charge damage by, it's not just lunar charge, it's also electro charge and bloom damage, but really the one that matters is the lunar charge damage by 15%, increased to 20 if you're in Ascendant Gleam. Electro charge and bloom damage in teams where she's the only Nullcry character is generally pathetic, and because of that, this C6 doesn't matter in those teams. So it only matters in teams where you have 2 Nullcries, which means you always have this 20% when the effect matters. So it's a 35% lunar reaction damage effectively. It's nice. It's not an insane deal. Like 35 is, it sounds high, but it stacks additively with other sources of lunar charge damage, including the EM multiplier. So this is not as high as you would think it is. I think that the most interesting thing about Aino is the way that you can use her in Arlecchino teams. Arlecchino teams right now are generally split into 4 different types of teams. You have the Melt teams, the Chevreuse teams, the Vape teams, and the Monopyro teams. The Chevreuse teams were the best Arlecchino teams back in the day, so despite their relative lack of focus in recent units, they're still very much good Arlecchino teams. The Melt teams got a big boost with Citlali, so they're pretty good now. The Vape teams actually got a nice boost with Inefa. And the Monopyro teams kind of have been forgotten at this point. You can still play them sometimes when you're against enemies that want you to play a lot of Pyro, like the Lava Dragon statue, or if you're against an enemy that gives you reactions without you having to build for it, like Dolpa. But you're generally focused on the other three nowadays, and Aino actually is likely to be an upgrade in those Arlecchino Inefa teams. Currently, with Arlecchino Inefa, you have a problem. Well, it's the same problem as the other Vape Arlecchino teams. Arlecchino by default can generally do a rotation that does 6 sets of 3 normal attacks or 3 sets of 5 normal attacks, so for 18 total hits in our rotation, which reduces her skill cooldown to 15.6 seconds. What that means is that your lower limit of rotation length in Arlecchino teams is around 16 seconds. However, the Hydro characters that we have in Arlecchino teams don't really align well with 16-second rotations. Pretty much the only Hydro character that we can play right now that lines up well in 16-second rotations is Candace C6. But a lot of people don't have that C6 because, well, Candace is not a particularly strong 4-star overall, so many people just don't want to get it. And then there's also some teams where Candace C6 is actually a downside, so sometimes there are people who don't want to activate it at all. Aino has a few different upsides. One, she applies Hydro for Arlecchino, obviously. And just like Candace, her cooldown is pretty low, so she can fit in those lower length rotations. On top of that, she is going to give you the non-cry resonance, which means if you play her with Inefa, you get Ascendant Gleam. You get the Ascendant Gleam passive effect, which increases your lunar charge damage by up to 36%, and it's pretty easy to cap out in an Arlecchino team. But you also now have access to the Null-Cry sets, right? Both the Null-Cry support set and the Null-Cry carry set. Now, the Null-Cry carry set isn't necessarily better than Arlecchino's set. However, it's about as good, which means you end up going for Flints, you end up using them, you end up farming for the set. You might see an upgrade to your Arlecchino team DPS from this set. But also you have the Silken Moon Serenade, which is 120 EM to her characters, so it's a nice little set bonus that also increases lunar reaction damage. Even outside of Inefa teams, though, it is possible that Aino will still work. Now, her application is a lot slower without this effect activated. It's once every 3 seconds, but I think there might be setups that allow for Aino to still apply enough for Arlecchino teams to replace Candace in the low cooldown Arlecchino teams. Will she be better than Candace? I don't know, but it'll be a lot easier to get to her ER requirements, and it won't be reliant on Constellations. In any case, let's do the usual pre-release stuff. Weapons is pretty straightforward. There are not a lot of weapons to consider on Aino. Her personal damage is pathetic. Aino does not have personal damage from her talents. However, when you play her in Lunar Charged or in Bloom teams, which you can do both, her EM matters a lot. What that means is you want to maximize the amount of EM that you have while still building enough ER to burst every rotation. None of the 5-star weapons actually helps with that. So we have the recent event weapon, the Flame Forged Insight, is 165 EM plus 120 EM plus 24 flat energy. This triggers once every 15 seconds, and you generally don't do rotations shorter than 15 seconds, so it's basically once per rotation, and it's 24 energy. Aino's burst only costs 50. Her particle generation isn't the best, but in exchange for that, her burst cost is pretty low. 24 energy on a 50 energy cost is a lot. It makes her actual energy cost basically 26. Which means that with this weapon, it's basically trivial to get her energy requirements. And on top of that, you get 285 EM. Offensively, this is generally her best option. Master Key gives you 120 EM when you trigger a reaction, and an additional 120 if you're in Ascendant Gleam, so it's 240 EM. But that's less than Flame Forged Insight. And on top of that, the 61 ER you get from it generally helps your energy less than the 24 flat energy restoration. In other words, Master Key, it has the stats you want, but it's just outright worse than the Flame Forged Insight, so the only reason to use it is if you missed the event. Next up is Fav Greatsword. Now, Aino's personal damage in her teams is pretty much always just gonna be the lunar charge contribution or the bloom contribution, which means that in teams where that contribution ends up being pretty low, right? Either because you're playing her in a bloom team where she's not the trigger for the reactions, or you're playing her in a lunar charge team where you have 2 other hydro or electro characters and she's the third contributor, so her contribution is divided by 12. 5 Greatsword ends up being the best weapon in those situations because her damage is low and you're better off just using a weapon that supports the rest of the team. And finally, you have Makara Aquamarine. At R5, it provides an attack buff to the wearer, but also other party members equal to a percentage of their EM. Now, with this on triple EM with the new set, it'll end up being upwards of like a 160-ish attack buff at R5, around 80 at R1 for your other characters, which is the best support weapon for increasing damage. Generally, that doesn't increase your team DPS as much as 5 Greatsword does, but that's assuming you need the particles, and there may be situations where you don't. Next is artifact sets. Artifact sets are pretty straightforward. She doesn't have any damage other than the lunar charge or bloom damage, which means that you're either putting her on a support set or on a reaction focused set. What are her options? Well, first is the Silken Moon Serenade. Other support sets, she can't use TOM because she doesn't have off-field skill damage, so it leaves you with Noblesse. She's not Natlan, so Cinder City's not gonna provide the big value, and also teams where you want to use her generally care less about damage percent, so we're gonna ignore Cinder City altogether. Instructor is just a worse Serenade, so generally it's not worth thinking about. And that leaves us with the damage focus sets, so you have like Flowers of Paradise Lost. And there's also Deepwood. There are situations where any of these sets can be your best option. So it's basically any of these 4 sets. Serenade is the default. It's always going to be pretty good. Noblesse is your main alternative. The biggest problem with Serenade is that, well, it doesn't stack with itself, so you can only use one on the team. And Aino might not be the only character on your team that can use the Serenade set, and so if someone else is on Serenade, you're gonna want Aino on a different set, and in that case, you'd probably go Noblesse. Flop is pretty much only for Nilo teams. In Nilo teams with Aino, because of Aino's fairly slow application, it's not that slow, but it's not very fast either, she ends up not overtaking the Dendro Aura, which means she will be your main trigger for bloom damage. Because of that, obviously, Flop becomes a viable set for her. It's not the only option in those teams though, because with the amount of team-wide buffs you stack in the Nilo teams, especially with Loma's release coming soon, focusing on any specific character's personal bloom contribution is becoming less and less ideal, and just focusing on team-wide buffs is starting to be a bit more appealing. And because of that, there are actually going to be situations where in a Nilo team, Aino's best artifact set option is Deepwood. Mainly, this is if you want to have Loma on the carry Natlan set, then you have Nilo and 2-piece, and then you need Deepwood and you want Serenade on your remaining 2, so you can use Deepwood or Serenade interchangeably between Aino and your second Dendro. Artifact stats, generally, you want EM, crit, but there are teams where you go for something different. If you're using Fav, you don't get the insane flat refund from the Flameforged Insight, so generally your ER requirements are actually a bit higher, so you can end up needing EM crit. If you play her in a Nilo team, the blooms don't scale with crit, so you just want to go EM. And finally, that leaves us with teams. So obviously, Flynn's good but replaceable. Alright, that's the biggest issue with Aino right now, is that her kit is designed around a character like Flynn's, and even with that, she's still kind of just a side grade to the characters that are not designed around Flynn's, which means I don't really see her staying in Flynn's teams long term. I'll talk a lot more about Flynn's with Aino in the Flynn's pre-release, so subscribe and don't miss it. Next is Loma. I'll also talk about the Loma stuff in more detail in the Loma pre-release, but the biggest issue in Loma teams with Aino is actually the Ascendant Gleam. Loma's passive provides a different buff based on your moon sign. The buff for Nascent Gleam, so One Nod Cry, is basically 15% more damage multiplicatively to your blues. It allows them to crit with a 15% chance to deal double damage. Ascendant Gleam instead gives you 40 crit value on Lunar Bloom damage. Now, the way Lunar Bloom works is it's not actually a reaction. Lunar Bloom damage is exclusively dealt through Loma's abilities. And while her personal damage isn't bad, it's also not great. She got a pretty big nerf during the beta that almost divided by 2 her Lunar Bloom damage. And this means that in most teams, the value of this effect is lower than the value of this effect. And that's actually the biggest problem with Aino and Llama teams, is that putting Aino on your team activates this, which is generally a DPS loss, because you can't get both buffs at the same time. You only get one of the two. You do get a few things in exchange, though. You get access to the Nodcry sets, both the support and the carry set. Support set on anyone on your team, carry set on Llama. You get access to the Nodcry Resonance, which slightly increases Llama's damage as well. You unlock the second part of the new Natlan Sword craftable that is going to be best in slot on Nilo. Right? When you're in Ascendant Gleam, you get an additional 32% HP on top of the 32% you get from the sword by itself. When you put all of those things together, Aino is generally fairly similar to the other Hydro units. However, her burst AoE isn't the biggest, and you can't move it after you've cast it, so there are still some potential gameplay difficulties. And also, because those teams, they end up focusing a little bit less on the bloom damage itself, because you lose the Llama passive, and more on Llama's personal damage through all the things that Llama gains for her Lunar Bloom damage when you get the Nodcry Resonance. It effectively makes it so that the team becomes fairly similar in single target, but worse in AoE, because it doesn't have that extra AoE bloom scaling anymore. Or at least the extra AoE bloom scaling is a bit worse. That being said, if you're someone who really likes Llama, the team that maximizes her personal damage as of 6.0 is going to use Aino. So she's alright in Llama teams. Next is Arlecchino. For Arlecchino, it's just outright pretty good. I don't know if you'll be able to properly get all your vapes without Aino's C2 that increases her hydro application through the extra electro application from Inefa. I'm a bit worried about that, but I think you should be fine. Other than that, there isn't really much else. Like, she can technically be used for other pyro carries as a hydro enabler, but she's not necessarily great there. The biggest upside she provides in those pyro carries teams is the access to shorter rotations, but there isn't really a pyro carry other than Arlecchino that can capitalize on that. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the Aino pre-release. Like I said, I will mostly be elaborating on Aino's roles in Flynn's and Llama teams in their respective pre-release videos, so you guys can look forward to that. As usual, I hope you learned a thing or two, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.